The racist officer arrested an innocent black man, but when he discovered the truth about the general's past, Officer James Crowley pulled his patrol car to a stop at the intersection of Maple and Oak in the quiet suburb of Millbrook. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns and well-maintained houses. It was a peaceful neighborhood, kind where nothing much ever happened. At least, that's what James had always thought. 43. James had been on the Millbrook police force for nearly 2 decades. He knew every street, every corner of this town, or so he believed. Lately, though, things had been changing. New faces were showing up, faces that didn't look like the ones he'd grown up seeing. It made him uneasy, though he'd never admit it out loud. As he waited for the light to change, James's radio crackled to life. "All units, we have a report of a possible break-in at 1242 Sycamore Drive. Neighbor reports seeing a black male sing entry through the front door." James felt a familiar surge of adrenaline. This was it, some action in this otherwise dull afternoon. He keyed his radio. Unit 14 responding, en route to 1242 Sycamore. As he flipped on his lights and siren, James couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. He'd been saying for months that the changing demographics of Millbrook would lead to an increase in crime. Now it seemed it was being proven right. James pulled up to 1242 Sycamore Drive, a stately 2-story colonial with a perfectly manicured lawn. First glance, nothing seemed amiss, but then he saw him, a tall black man in jeans and a hoodie, standing on the front porch, fiddling with the door. Without hesitation, James leapt from his patrol car, hand on his holstered weapon. "Police! Freeze! Put your hands where I can see them." The man on the porch turned, startled. "Excuse me?" "I said, put your hands up, now," James barked, drawing his weapon. The man slowly raised his hands, his expression a mix of confusion and growing anger. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I live here," James scoffed. "Yeah, right. I know every family on this street, and there's no black families living here. Now, turn around and put your hands behind your back." "Officer, please," the man said, his voice remaining calm despite the situation. "My name is Michael Richardson. I just moved in last week. If you'll allow me to reach into my pocket, I can show you my ID." "Don't move," James shouted, taking a step closer. "I'm not falling for that trick. You're under arrest for attempted burglary." As James approached, handcuffs at the ready, he failed to notice the sleek black sedan pulling up to the curb. He was so focused on the man he believed to be a criminal that he didn't see the driver, a middle-aged white woman, exit the vehicle with a look of horror on her face. "James Crowley, what on earth do you think you're doing?" James froze, recognizing the voice immediately. It was Margaret Whitaker, Millbrook's mayor. He turned, confusion etched on his face. "Madam Mayor, I am apprehending a burglar." Mayor Whitaker's face was a mask of barely contained fury. "Burglar? James? Dev, that burglar is General Michael Richardson, U.S. Army. He's our new neighbor, and I was just giving him a tour of the town." James felt the blood drain from his face. He turned back to the man on the porch, really looking at him for the first time. The man, General Richardson, stood tall and dignified, his hands still raised, but his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Officer," General Richardson said, his voice steady and authoritative, "I would appreciate it if you would lower your weapon now." James holstered his gun, his mind reeling. How had this happened? How had he misread the situation so badly? Mayor Whitaker strode up the walk, positioning herself between James and the general. "James, I think you owe General Richardson an apology, and then I think you and I need to have a very serious conversation." As James struggled to find the words to apologize, he became acutely aware of the neighbors gathering on their lawns, watching the scene unfold. He saw the shock on their faces, the disapproval, anger. In that moment, James Crowley realized that his world, the world he thought he knew so well, had just been turned upside down. General Richardson, still standing on his porch with the dignity of a man who had faced far worse than an ignorant police officer, finally lowered his hand. "Officer Crowley," he said, his voice carrying the weight of command, "I think it's time we all had a conversation about what just happened here, and more importantly, why it happened." James nodded mutely, sinking feeling in his stomach. He knew this wasn't going to be a simple apology and handshake. This moment, This terrible mistake was going to have consequences that would ripple far beyond this quiet street in Millbrook. As Mayor Whitaker ushered them all inside the house, James caught snippets of conversation from the gathering crowd. "You see that? Can't believe Crowley did that. Always knew he was a racist." The words stung, but a small part of James knew they weren't entirely wrong. He had acted on instinct, on assumptions he'd held for years without ever really examining them. Now, as he stepped into General Richardson's home, the home he'd accused the general of trying to rob, James knew he was about to face some hard truths about himself and the world he thought he knew. The interior of the house was a stark contrast to the tension outside. Boxes were still stacked in the corners, evidence of the recent move. Family photos lined the mantel. General Richardson in his dress uniform, standing proud at various ceremonies. Pictures of him with his wife and children. Awards and commendations displayed on the walls. James felt a wave of shame wash over him. How could he have been so blind? So quick to judge based solely on the color of a man's skin? General Richardson gestured for them to sit in the living room. Mayor Whitaker took a seat in an armchair, while James perched uneasily on the edge of the sofa. The general remained standing, his presence filling the room. "Officer Crowley," General Richardson began, his voice calm but firm. "I've faced discrimination before. I've been pulled over for driving while black, been followed in stores, had people cross the street to avoid me. But never, in all my years of service to this country, have I been accused of breaking into my own home." James opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say to make this right? Mayor Whitaker leaned forward, her face a mix of concern and determination. "James, I've known you since you were a rookie on the force. I never thought I'd see the day when you'd act like this. What were you thinking?" James swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet the mayor's gaze. I received a call about a break-in. The report mentioned a black male forcing entry. I saw the general on the porch and I just assumed." "You assumed," General Richardson repeated, his voice heavy with disappointment. "You saw a black man in a predominantly white neighborhood, and you assumed he was a criminal. Do you understand the weight of that assumption, Officer Crowley? Do you understand what it means to live in a world where people look at you and see a threat, no matter who you are or what you've accomplished?" The general's words hit James like a physical blow. He'd always prided himself on being a good cop, on protecting his community. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he was beginning to see how his biases had colored his judgment, had led him to this moment of shame and regret. "I'm sorry," James said, the words feeling woefully inadequate. "I made a terrible mistake. I let my preconceptions cloud my judgment, and I acted in a way that was unprofessional and racist. There's no excuse for what I did." Mayor Whitaker nodded, a hint of approval in her eyes at James's admission. "You're right, there is no excuse, but acknowledgement is the first step. The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" General Richardson moved to the window, looking out at the neighborhood that was supposed to be his new home. "Officer Crowley, I could file a formal complaint. I could demand your badge. Perhaps that would be justified, but I don't believe that would solve the underlying problem." He turned back to face James and the mayor. "What happened here today is a symptom of a larger issue. It's not just about one officer or one incident. It's about the biases that exist in our society, often unexamined and unchallenged. And it's about the systems that allow those biases to impact people's lives in very real and dangerous ways." James felt a glimmer of hope. Was the general suggesting there might be a way forward from this? A way for him to make amends? "So what do you propose, General?" Mayor Whitaker asked, leaning forward with interest. General Richardson's gaze locked onto James. "Officer Crowley, I propose that you and I work together, that we use this incident as a catalyst for change in Millbrook. I want you to undergo intensive bias training to learn about the experiences of people of color in this country. And then, I want us to develop a program to bring that training to the entire Millbrook police force." James blinked in surprise. This was not the outcome he had expected. You want to work with me? After what I did?" The general's expression softened slightly. "Officer Crowley, in my years of service, I've learned that people can change, that mistakes, even grave ones, can be stepping stones to growth, but it requires honesty, humility, and a willingness to do the hard work of self-examination and change. He paused, his gaze intensifying. The question is, are you willing to do that work? James felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He knew that his answer would shape not just his future, but potentially the future of the entire Millbrook community. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenge ahead. "Yes," he said, his voice firm despite his inner turmoil. "Yes, I'm willing to do the work. I want to be better. I want our department to be better." Mayor Whitaker nodded approvingly. "I think this could be the start of something important for our town, James. But make no mistake, this won't be easy. There will be consequences for your actions today, and the road ahead will be challenging." As the three of them began to discuss the details of what this program might look like, James couldn't shake the feeling that his life had irrevocably changed. He had come to this house expecting to make an arrest. Instead, he found himself embarking on a journey of self-discovery and community transformation. Outside, the gathered neighbors began to disperse, but the ripples of what had transpired would soon spread throughout Millbrook. The arrest that never was would become the talk of the town, a spark that would ignite a broader conversation about race, policing, and community in this quiet suburb. For James Crowley, for General Michael Richardson, for Mayor Whitaker, and for the town of Millbrook, this was just the beginning. The real work, the hard, necessary work of confronting biases, challenging assumptions, and fostering understanding, was yet to come. As the sun began to set on Sycamore Drive, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, the three individuals in the living room of 1242 continued their discussion, laying the groundwork for a program that had the potential to transform not just a police department, but an entire community. The weight of prejudice had brought them together in conflict. Now it would be the commitment to understanding and change that would bind them in a common purpose. The road ahead would be long and challenging, but in that moment, in the fading light of a tumultuous day, first tentative steps toward progress were being taken. Following morning, Officer James Crowley sat in Chief Robert Anderson's office, his shoulders slumped and his eyes fixed on the floor. The events of the previous day played on a loop in his mind, each replay bringing a fresh wave of shame and regret. Chief Anderson, a man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a stern demeanor, leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of disappointment. "James," began, voice heavy, "I've known you for a long time. I've watched you grow from a rookie into what I thought was one of our best officers. So you can imagine my shock when I got a call from the mayor last night about what happened on Sycamore Drive." James nodded, unable to meet his superior's gaze. "Chief, I made a terrible mistake. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I acted in a way that was completely unacceptable." The chief leaned forward, his eyes boring into James. "You're damn right it was unacceptable. Do you have any idea of the potential consequences of your actions? If General Richardson had chosen to press charges, this had escalated. James, you could have ruined your career. More importantly, you could have ruined a man's life." The weight of the chief's words hit James like a physical blow. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on serving and protecting his community. But now, faced with the reality of his actions, he realized how far he had strayed from those ideals. "I understand, Chief," James said, finally looking up, "and I'm prepared to face whatever consequences you deem appropriate." Chief Anderson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Well, that's the thing, James. The mayor and General Richardson have proposed something unconventional. They want you to undergo intensive bias training and then help develop a program to bring that training to our entire force." James nodded. "Yes, sir. We discussed that yesterday. I want to do it. I want to be better, to help make our department better." The chief studied James for a long moment. "It won't be easy, you know. There will be officers who resent this, who see it as an attack on the force. And make no mistake, there will still be consequences for your actions. You're suspended without pay for 2 weeks, effective immediately. During that time, you'll begin your training with General Richardson." James accepted the punishment without protest. In truth, felt like a small price to pay for the gravity of his mistake. "One more thing," the chief added, tone grave. "This incident has already hit the local news. It's only a matter of time before it goes national. You need to be prepared for the scrutiny that's coming." As if on cue, there was a commotion outside the chief's office. Raised voices could be heard, growing louder by the second. Suddenly, the door burst open. A young black woman strode in, her eyes blazing with anger. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where's the officer who tried to arrest my father?" James felt his heart sink as he recognized the woman from the family photos in General Richardson's home. This must be the general's daughter. Chief Anderson stood, his voice calm but firm. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private meeting." Woman ignored him, her gaze locking onto James. "Are you Officer Crowley?" she asked, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. James nodded, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "Yes, I am, and you must be General Richardson's daughter. I'm so sore." "Save it." Cut him off. "I don't want your apologies. Do you have any idea what you've done? My father has spent his entire life serving this country, fighting for people's rights, and you treated him like a common criminal because of the color of his skin." Her words cut deep, each one a painful reminder of the harm James had caused. But he knew he had to face this, to truly understand the impact of his action. "You're right," James said softly. "What I did was inexcusable. I acted on prejudiced assumption, and I'm deeply ashamed of my behavior. I know words aren't enough. I want you to know that I'm committed to doing better. Being better." The woman seemed taken aback by James's candid admission. She had clearly come expecting a fight, not contrition. For a moment, the anger in her eyes flickered, replaced by a mix of surprise and uncertainty. Chief Anderson seized the moment to intervene. "Miss Richardson, I understand your anger, and it's completely justified. But I want you to know that we're taking this incident very seriously. Officer Crowley has been suspended, and we're implementing a comprehensive bias training program in response to this incident." Miss Richardson's gaze shifted between James and the chief. "A training program? You think that's enough to fix this?" "No," James said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "It's not enough. It's just a start. But I promise you, I'm committed to doing whatever it takes to address the biases in myself and in our department. Your father has given me an opportunity to learn and grow from this mistake, and I intend to make the most of it." For a long moment, Miss Richardson stood silent, studying James intently. Finally she spoke, her voice calmer, but still edged with skepticism. "My father has always believed in giving people second chances. I'm not sure I agree with him in this case, but I respect his decision. Just know this, Officer Crowley, I'll be watching, and if you fail to live up to your promises, if you let my father down, you'll have me to answer to." With that, she turned and strode out of the office, leaving a heavy silence in her wake. Chief Anderson sank back into his chair, exhaling slowly. "Well, James, I hope you're ready for this, because that's just a taste of what you're going to face in the coming weeks." James nodded, a mixture of determination and apprehension settling in his gut. "I understand, Chief, and I'm ready to face it. I have to be." As James left the station that day, his badge and gun left behind on the chief's desk, he felt as if he were stepping into a new world. Familiar streets of Millbrook seemed different somehow, faces of passers-by more scrutinizing. He knew that news of the incident must have spread, and he could feel the weight of judgment in every glance cast his way. But amidst the discomfort, James felt something else stirring within him, a sense of purpose. He had been given an opportunity, not just to make amends for his mistake, but to be part of something larger, something that could bring about real change. As he drove home, James's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from General Richardson. "Officer Crowley, please come to my house tomorrow at 9 a.m. Our work begins." James took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges ahead. He knew the road would be difficult, filled with hard truths and uncomfortable realizations. But he was ready to walk it, ready to confront the biases that had led him to this point. For the first time in days, James felt a glimmer of hope. He had made a grave mistake, but from that mistake, something positive could grow. It was up to him now to nurture that potential, to turn this moment of shame into an opportunity for growth and change. As he pulled into his driveway, James caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face that looked back at him was tired, strained, but there was a determination in the eyes that hadn't been there before. Tomorrow, he would begin his journey toward becoming not just a better police officer, but a better person. Maybe, just maybe, could help make Millbrook a better place in the process. Little did James know that the path ahead would be far more challenging and transformative than he could have ever imagined. The lessons he would learn, the changes he would undergo, and the impact he would have on his community were yet to unfold. But in that moment, as he stepped out of his car and into the uncertain future, James Crowley was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The sun was setting on Millbrook, casting long shadows across the town. As darkness fell, it seemed to mirror the shadow that had been cast over the community by recent events. But in that darkness, a spark had been lit. A spark of change, of growth, of hope. And from that spark, a new day would dawn. Not just for James Crowley, for all of Millbrook. The next morning, James Crowley stood on the porch of 1242 Sycamore Drive, his hand poised to knock. He hesitated, the weight of yesterday's confrontation with Miss Richardson still heavy on his mind. Taking a deep breath, he rapped on the door. General Michael Richardson answered promptly, his posture straight and his gaze steady. "Officer Crowley," he said, his voice neutral. "Please come in." As James stepped into the house, he was struck once again by the family photos lining the walls. The faces of General Richardson's wife and children seemed to watch him, a silent reminder of the far-reaching consequences of his action. "Sir," James began, "I want to apologize again for—" The general held up a hand, cutting him off. "Officer Crowley, we're not here to rehash apologies. We're here to work. Are you ready for that?" James nodded, squaring his shoulders. "Yes, sir, I am." General Richardson led him to a study lined with bookshelves. On a large desk sat several thick binders and a stack of books. "This," the general said, gesturing to the materials, "is where we begin." For the next several hours, James found himself immersed in a crash course on the history of race relations in America. The general guided him through historical texts, sociological studies, and personal accounts of discrimination and prejudice. As the morning wore on, James felt as if scales were falling from his eyes. He had always considered himself reasonably well informed about history. The depth and breadth of what he was learning left him reeling. I had no idea," James murmured, looking up from a particularly harrowing account of a police brutality case from the 1960s. "How is it possible I didn't know about these things?" General Richardson's expression softened slightly. "That's part of the problem, Officer Crowley. Many people, especially those who haven't experienced discrimination firsthand, simply aren't aware of the full scope of these issues. But ignorance, while it may explain actions, doesn't excuse them." James nodded, feeling the weight of the general's words. "I understand that now, sir, and I'm committed to learning, to doing better." As they broke for lunch, James noticed a photo on the general's desk that he hadn't seen before. It showed a much younger Michael Richardson in army fatigues, standing next to a white soldier. Both men were grinning, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. The general followed James's gaze. "That's me and Jimmy Hawkins," he said, fond smile playing on his lips. "We served together in Desert Storm. Best friend I ever had." James studied the photo, struck by the easy camaraderie between the two men. "You look close," he observed. "We were," the general replied, his voice tinged with sadness. "Jimmy saved my life more than once over there, and yet when we came home—" He trailed off, lost in thought for a moment. "What happened?" James asked softly. General Richardson sighed. "When we got back to the States, Jimmy invited me to his hometown in Alabama. Small place, not unlike Millbrook. We stopped at a local diner for lunch. The owner took one look at me and told Jimmy he didn't serve my kind there." James felt a knot form in his stomach. What did Jimmy do? "He was furious," General recalled. "Told the owner that I was a decorated soldier, that I'd saved American lives, and the owner just shrugged and said, 'Don't care what he did over there. Reams or reams.'" The general's eyes met James's, gaze intense. "Jimmy and I left that diner and never went back. But do you know what struck me the most, Officer Crowley? It wasn't the owner's blatant racism. It was the fact that my best friend, a man who had seen me bleed for our country, was genuinely shocked that something like that could happen. He had never had to confront the reality of racism in America until that moment. James felt a wave of shame wash over him. How many times had he been like Jimmy, blind to the experiences of those around him? "I'm telling you this," the general continued, "because I want you to understand something. The work we're doing here isn't just about you learning facts and figures. It's about opening your eyes to experiences and realities that you might have been blind to before. It's about developing empathy and understanding people whose lives might be very different from your own." As they resumed their study in the afternoon, James found himself approaching the material with a new perspective. He wasn't just reading about historical events or abstract concepts anymore. He was trying to understand the lived experiences of real people. People like General Richardson, people in his own community. As the day drew to a close, the general assigned James a stack of books and articles to read before their next session. "This is just the beginning, Officer Crowley," said. "The real test will come when you take what you're learning here and apply it in your daily life and work." James nodded, feeling both overwhelmed and oddly invigorated. "I understand, sir, and I'm ready for it." As James left the general's house that evening, his mind was buzzing with new information and perspectives. He felt as if he were seeing the world through new eyes, noticing things he had overlooked before. On his drive home, he found himself paying more attention to the people around him. He noticed the wary glance a young black man gave him as he stopped at a traffic light. He saw the way an elderly Asian couple quickened their pace as they passed a group of rowdy teenagers. Small interactions that he might have dismissed before now seemed laden with meaning and context. When he arrived home, James was surprised to find a small group of people gathered on his front lawn. As he got out of his car, he recognized them as fellow officers from the Millbrook Police Department. "Hey, Crowley," one of them called out. "We heard about what happened. We're here to show our support." James felt a mixture of gratitude and unease. "Thanks, guys," he said cautiously. "I appreciate that." One of the officers, a veteran named Mike Thompson, stepped forward. "Look, James, we all know you're not a bad guy. This whole sensitivity training thing, it's just politics, right? You don't really buy into all that stuff, do you?" James felt a knot form in his stomach. Just this morning, he might have agreed with Mike. But now, after everything he had learned and experienced today, "Actually, Mike," James said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I think this training is important. What I did wasn't right. And I'm learning that there's a lot I didn't understand about race and policing." The group of officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Come on, James," another officer spoke up. "We've all had to deal with troublemakers. You were just doing your job." James shook his head firmly. "No, I wasn't. I made assumptions based on race, and I almost arrested an innocent man because of it. That's not doing our job. That's the opposite of what our job should be." A tense silence fell over the group. James could see the discomfort and confusion on his colleagues' faces. He realized that his journey wasn't just going to be about personal change. It was going to affect his relationships, his place in the department, maybe even the entire culture of policing in Millbrook. As the officers began to disperse, some with muttered goodbyes and others in uncomfortable silence, James felt a mix of emotions wash over him. He was grateful for the support of his colleagues, but he also recognized that true change would require challenging long-held beliefs and practices, not just his own, but those of the entire department. Entering his house, James was greeted by the silence that had become all too familiar since his divorce 2 years ago. But tonight, that silence felt different. It wasn't just empty, it was expectant, as if the very air around him was waiting to see what he would do next. He sat down at his kitchen table, spreading out the books and articles General Richardson had given him. As he began to read, James realized that this was more than just a training exercise, or a way to make amends for one mistake. This was the beginning of a fundamental shift in how he saw the world, his place in it. As the night wore on and the pile of reading material slowly diminished, James found himself thinking about the future. How would he apply what he was learning to his work as a police officer? How could he help bring about change in his department, in Millbrook, maybe even beyond? He didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in days, James felt a sense of purpose. He had been given an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to make a real difference, and he was determined to make the most of it. Little did James know that his journey was about to take an unexpected turn. The lessons he was learning would soon be put to the test in ways he couldn't have anticipated, challenging not just his newfound understanding, the very foundations of law enforcement in Millbrook. As he finally went to bed in the early hours of the morning, James Crowley was a man transformed. The officer who had arrested General Richardson was gone, replaced by someone who was beginning to see the world in a new light. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but James was ready to walk it, one step at a time. 2 weeks into his training with General Richardson, James Crowley found himself facing an unexpected challenge. He had just arrived at the general's house for their daily session when he noticed an unfamiliar car in the driveway. As he approached the front door, he could hear raised voices from inside. James hesitated, unsure whether to knock or wait. Before he could decide, the door swung open, revealing General Richardson and a young black man James didn't recognize. "Ah, Officer Crowley," the general said, his voice tense. "Please, come in. There's someone I'd like you to meet." As James entered, he could feel the young man's eyes on him, filled with a mixture of anger and suspicion. "Officer Crowley, this is my nephew, Marcus," General Richardson introduced. "Marcus, this is Officer James Crowley." Marcus's jaw tightened. "So you're the cop who tried to arrest my uncle." James felt a familiar pang of shame, but he met Marcus's gaze steadily. "Yes, I am, and I'm here to learn from my mistakes and do better." Marcus scoffed. "Learn? Do better? Man, you almost ruined my uncle's life because of your racist assumptions. How do you do better than that?" General Richardson placed a hand on his nephew's shoulder. "Marcus, that's why Officer Crowley is here. He's committed to change, to understanding the impact of his actions." Marcus shrugged off his uncle's hand. "Understanding? Uncle Mike, with all due respect, this isn't about understanding. This is about a system that's fundamentally broken. No amount of training is going to fix that." James felt a surge of defensiveness, but he bit it back. This was exactly the kind of confrontation he needed to learn from. "Marcus," said carefully, "I know you have no reason to trust me or believe in what I'm trying to do here, but I'm listening. I want to hear your perspective." For a moment, Marcus looked taken aback. He had clearly been expecting an argument, not an invitation to speak. Then, as if a dam had broken, words began to pour out of him. Marcus spoke of his experiences growing up black in America, of the constant fear and vigilance required just to navigate daily life. He talked about friends who had been harassed by police, about job opportunities lost due to subtle and sometimes not so subtle discrimination. He shared the pain of watching news reports of unarmed black men and women dying at the hands of law enforcement, and the helpless rage that came with each non-indictment, each acquittal. As Marcus spoke, James listened intently. He had heard similar stories over the past 2 weeks, both from General Richardson and from the materials he had been studying. Hearing it directly from Marcus, seeing the raw emotion in the young man's eyes, made it all the more real and immediate. When Marcus finally fell silent, the room was heavy with unspoken tension. James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Marcus, thank you for sharing that with me. I can't pretend to fully understand what you've been through, what you're going through. But I want you to know that I'm here because I recognize that I've been part of the problem. And I'm committed being part of the solution." Marcus studied James for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Words are easy, Officer Crowley. What are you actually going to do?" It was a fair question, and one that James had been grappling with himself. "Honestly, I'm still figuring that out. But I know it starts with listening, really hearing stories like yours. It means examining my own biases and working to overcome them. And it means using my position within the police force to advocate for real, systemic change." General Richardson, who had been silent throughout this exchange, now spoke up. "Marcus, that's actually why I asked you to come here today. Officer Crowley and I have been discussing ways to bring this training to the entire Millbrook Police Department. We were hoping you might be willing to be part of that process." Marcus looked skeptical. "You want me to talk to a room full of cops about my experiences? Uncle Mike, you can't be serious." "I am serious," General replied. "Who better to help these officers understand the real-world impact of their actions than someone like you who has lived it?" James nodded in agreement. "Marcus, I know it's a lot to ask, but your voice, your experiences, they could make a real difference. Help us make this training more than just an academic exercise." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the idea. Finally, he spoke. "I'll think about it, but I'm not making any promises." As Marcus left, James turned to General Richardson. "Sir, I hope I didn't overstep by inviting Marcus to be part of the training." General shook his head. "No, James. In fact, I'm glad you did. This is exactly the kind of initiative we need if we're going to make real change." The rest of that day's session was spent discussing how to incorporate more diverse voices and experiences into the training program. As James drove home that evening, his mind was buzzing with ideas and possibilities. But reality came crashing back the next morning when James received a call from Chief Anderson. "Crowley." The chief's voice was tense. "We've got a situation. There's been a shooting in the Oak Hill neighborhood. Young black male victim, white shooter claiming self-defense. I need you to come in." James felt his heart race. Oak Hill was a predominantly black neighborhood that had a history of tense relations with police. And now, with racial tensions already high due to his own recent actions, "Chief," James said cautiously, "are you sure you want me there? Given everything that's happened." "That's exactly why I want you there, Crowley," the chief replied. "You've been getting this special training. Now it's time to put it to use. I need someone who can navigate this situation sensitively." As James hung up the phone, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. This was it. His first real test since beginning his training with General Richardson. Could he apply what he had learned in a high-pressure, potentially volatile situation? As he put on his uniform for the first time in weeks, James caught sight of himself in the mirror. The face that looked back at him was the same. The man behind that face changed. He was no longer the officer who had unthinkingly arrested General Richardson. He was someone new, someone still learning and growing, someone committed to doing better. James took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. As he headed out the door, he realized that this case would be more than just an investigation. It would be a test of everything he had learned, a chance to show his community and himself that real change was possible. Little did he know that the events about to unfold would challenge him in ways he couldn't have imagined, forcing him to confront not just his own biases, but the deep-rooted issues within the entire criminal justice system. True test of James Crowley's transformation was about to begin. James arrived at the scene in Oak Hill, his heart pounding. The street was already cordoned off, blue and red lights flashing from multiple police vehicles. A crowd had gathered at the perimeter, their faces a mix of anger, fear, and curiosity. As James stepped out of his car, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He recognized some faces from his community outreach work, but now they looked at him with suspicion and distrust. The incident with General Richardson had clearly eroded whatever goodwill he had built up over the years. Detective Sarah Martinez, a veteran officer known for her no-nonsense approach, met him at the crime scene tape. "Glad you're here, Crowley," she said, her voice low. "This situation is a powder keg waiting to explode." James nodded, taking in the scene. "What do we know so far?" Sarah led him towards a modest single-story house, filling him in as they walked. Victim is Jamal Turner, 19 years old. Shot once in the chest. He's been taken to Millbrook General, condition critical. The shooter is inside, says his name is Eric Larson, 45. Claims Turner was trying to break into his car and that he fired in self-defense. James felt his stomach tighten. This was exactly the kind of situation that could tear a community apart. "Has Larson been arrested?" Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. That's part of why the chief wanted you here. We need to handle this carefully." As they approached the house, James could see Eric Larson through the window. He was a middle-aged white man, pacing nervously in his living room. Two officers stood guard, keeping a watchful eye on him. "Let me talk to him," James said. Sarah raised an eyebrow, but nodded her assent. James entered the house, acutely aware of the tension in the air. "Mr. Larson?" he said, keeping his voice calm and neutral. "I'm Officer James Crowley. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened here tonight." Larson turned to face him, his eyes wild with a mix of fear and defiance. "I was defending my property," he blurted out. "That's my right, isn't it? He was trying to steal my car. I warned him, but he didn't listen." James held up a hand, trying to project calm. "Let's start from the beginning, Mr. Larson. Tell me exactly what you saw and heard." As Larson recounted his version of events, James listened carefully, not just to the words but to what wasn't being said. He noticed the tremor in Larson's hands, the way his eyes darted nervously to the window where the crowd could be seen gathering. "Did you see a weapon?" James asked. "Did Jamal Turner threaten you in any way?" Larson hesitated. "Well, no, but it was dark. He could have had something. I felt threatened." James nodded, keeping his expression neutral, even as his mind raced. He thought back to his training with General Richardson, to the discussions about implicit bias and threat perception. How often had unarmed black men been shot because they were perceived as threats, even when they weren't? "Mr. Larson," James said carefully, "I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. A young man is fighting for his life because of your actions. I'm going to need you to come down to the station to give a formal statement." Larson's face fell. Am I under arrest?" James took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth. Everything he had learned in the past weeks, everything he believed about justice and equality, came down to this decision. "Yes, Mr. Larson," he said firmly. "You're under arrest for aggravated assault. You have the right to remain silent." As James read Larson his rights and placed him in handcuffs, he could feel the eyes of the other officers on. He knew this decision wouldn't be popular with everyone on the force, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. Outside, the crowd had grown larger and more agitated. As James led Larson to a patrol car, he could hear shouts and jeers from the onlookers. "Justice for Jamal," someone yelled. "Lock him up." James helped Larson into the back of the patrol car, then turned to face the crowd. He recognized a familiar face. Marcus, General Richardson's nephew, was at the front of the group, his expression a mix of anger and expectation. Taking a deep breath, James stepped forward. "I know you're all angry and frightened," began, raising his voice to be heard over the murmur of the crowd. "I want you to know that we are taking this situation very seriously. Mr. Larson has been arrested, and we will be conducting a thorough investigation." The crowd quieted slightly, listening. James continued, "I promise you, we will pursue justice in this case. But I need your help. We need witnesses to come forward to tell us what they saw or heard. And we need you to trust in the process." Marcus pushed his way to the front. "Why should we trust you?" he demanded. "How do we know this isn't just going to be another cover-up?" James met Marcus's gaze steadily. "Because I give you my word," he said. "I've learned a lot these past few weeks about bias, about systemic injustice. I can't change the whole system overnight, but I can promise you that I will do everything in my power to ensure that this case is handled fairly and transparently." For a long moment, Marcus stared at James, as if trying to gauge his sincerity. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. As the crowd began to disperse, James felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Sarah Martinez looking at him with a mix of respect and concern. "You handled that well, Crowley," she said. "But you know this isn't over. The department is going to be under a microscope for how we handle this case. And not everyone is going to agree with your approach." James nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. "I know," he said, "but it's the right thing to do. We can't keep doing things the old way and expect different results." As James drove back to the station that night, his mind was whirling. He knew that his actions today would have far-reaching consequences, not just for himself, for the entire department. He had taken a stand, chosen to apply what he had learned from General Richardson in a real-world situation. But would it be enough? The coming days and weeks would be crucial. The investigation into the shooting, public's reaction, the response from within the police department. All of these would test James's newfound conviction. And beyond this single case, there were larger questions to grapple with. How could they reform the entire system? How could they bridge the gap of trust between the police and the communities they served? As he pulled into the station parking lot, James's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from General Richardson. "Heard about what happened in Oak Hill. You did good, son, but the real work is just beginning." James smiled grimly as he read the message. The general was right, of course. This was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, filled with challenges and setbacks. For the first time in his career, James felt like he was on the right path. As he stepped out of his car and walked towards the station, James Crowley was no longer just a police officer. He was a man on a mission, determined to be a force for change in a system that desperately needed it. The weight of prejudice that had brought him to this point now fueled his determination to make a difference. Little did he know that the events set in motion today would lead to changes far beyond what he could imagine, not just in Millbrook, but in police departments across the country. The true test of James Crowley's transformation was just beginning, and its effects would ripple out in ways that would challenge and change lives for years to come.